we have 2 sessions that will run consecutively. We have speakers, and I want to read the first session speakers. Dr. Hakala will be the one opening for us this webinar. Will be followed by Dr. Wamai. After Dr. Wamai, we will have Clifford Collins Omondi Okwanyi. Those are the first 3 speakers that will present their papers for 15 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll have a collective Q&A session for about 20 minutes. I want to start with Dr. Hakala, and I want to say this with regard to this scholar, that she is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and postdoctoral researcher in the project entitled Toxic Crimes, Legal Activism Against Wartime Environmental Destruction at the University of Helsinki. Hakala's research focuses on environmental security and the geopolitics of climate change. Recently, she has been examining the integration of climate change into civil preparedness and emerging risks in Nordic countries. Hakala also leads the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, part of the project entitled Water Cooperation and Peace Finnish Waterway, which is being implemented in partnership with the Finnish Environment Institute. I will call upon Dr. Hakala to take the stage for the next 15 minutes. Dr. Hakala, welcome.
Thank you so much. And hello from me to all of you, esteemed participants. It's really nice, and I'm really thankful to be involved in this webinar, and really interested in hearing all of the speakers and the discussion today. So really delighted to be a part of it. I will share my screen with you in order to get to my presentation, and hopefully you will see it now. I will just put it in a full screen mode, and then if for some reason you don't see my slides anymore or something weird happens, then just let me know. But yes, I will get straight to business. I think my own presentation will be at a rather general level, which I hope will be acceptable, because I think the other speakers will have really interesting and more maybe elaborate examples on the intersection of climate change and peace building. So maybe this will work as some kind of an introduction to the theme. So let's get started with just what is climate security. I know that this is actually a very complex and broad term, which is being used in many different ways and in many different contexts. But just as a very sort of brief maybe definition, I would say that climate security research examines the threats that climate change poses to the society and individuals. And this is a very wide range, as we will discover in my presentation later on. But then climate security is also very broadly used as a policy concept, which has been discussed, for example, at the Security Council of the UN, and increasingly, for example, by the NATO and many other organizations. So there is an overlap between research and or policy discourse in this sense. And it's also important to note that climate security is based on this wider perspective of security, which also covers the human aspects of security. But it also does cover national security. And I think that we will see during today, for example, that we have to take a very sort of comprehensive approach and take into account the effects of climate change, both on sort of individuals and the human side of it, but then also these more maybe national security and even geopolitical aspects. All right, then I will not go into too much detail about the specific impacts of climate change. I think many of you are probably aware of them, and they have also been mentioned here today already. This is just to give you some kind of a maybe context from the latest IPSTC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report on the impacts of climate change, and the very sort of latest scientific knowledge tells us that we can expect and indeed are already experiencing more frequent and more intense extreme heat, also more frequent and more intense heavy rainfall, then also increasing drought in many regions of the world, and linked to that, fire weather or wildfires are becoming more frequent. And then we also have this sort of ecosystem level damages, for example, sort of directed at oceans, which are losing oxygen and becoming warmer. And all of this together has the potential to have life-threatening effects on individuals and societies. And maybe also one key takeaway here is that actually climate change will make everything more unpredictable. So it's not always that one region will just become more warmer as a sort of course over a longer trend it will, but the weather might vary very much from year to year, and also from the sort of annual circle of climate, and that makes everything very difficult, especially in very sort of, for example, agriculture based societies. But what does this mean then for security more specifically? And this is something that I've tried to kind of maybe make it easier for at least myself to understand the security impacts of climate change, because it is, as I mentioned, a very wide array of issues. So I've tried to categorize these effects or impacts into 3 different categories. So these are direct impacts, cascading impacts, and transition impacts. And I will explain a bit more specifically what I mean with all of these. So the direct impacts are the ones that are maybe the most obvious when we think about climate change and security. These are the direct impacts of environmental change on societies and the individuals. And they can be either very sudden and short term, or slow onset and long term. So these would include then, for example, storms or floods and droughts, sea level rise, extreme heat, and so on. So these have the potential to directly threaten human lives and health, basically. And these kinds of effects we unfortunately see everywhere in the world already at the moment, but they are expected to become worse and more severe. But then that's unfortunately not enough, but we also have what I call cascading impacts, where the environmental or climate factor is somehow combined with socioeconomic factors or even geopolitical impacts. And these often then tend to form into these chains of effects that also can go across national borders, and they can affect a very broad sort of geographical area, but just sometimes in different ways. And that's what I mean by these chains of effects, that they kind of cascade over time and both over geographic areas. So these would include issues like conflicts, not necessarily so that again, climate change would be the sole cause of conflict anywhere, but with other socioeconomic factors in place, for example, very fragile nations or states, it has the potential to increase the risk of conflict. Similarly, climate change can cause disruptions in supply chains, which is maybe something that we already saw during the recent pandemic, but in a more specific way, climate impacts in some very important choke points of supply chains globally can have consequences then that kind of cascade again around the world. We also know that climate change increases global inequality. It often affects the regions that are often the least sort of responsible for climate change, and often also maybe the poorest or the least imposed or like equipped to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So this increases global inequality, and maybe connected to that also partly it has the tendency to increase forced migration. So of course people need to leave their homes as a result of climate change, and this can cause all kinds of impacts, especially on the people who need to leave their homes, obviously, but then also on the target regions where they flee to. So these are the cascading impacts. And then finally, we have transition impacts, which are the consequences of mitigating and adapting to climate change. And here, I don't in any way mean to say that we shouldn't be mitigating climate change. We need to do it very efficiently, but just because of the fact that we have left it so late in a way to do adequate climate mitigation, it means that we have to do some rather large structural changes in the society. And this will then somehow tip the balance within societies and also between them. That could lead to all kinds of internal opposition and kind of polarization, which can then contribute to instability. So this would be examples like deteriorating superpower relations and increasing tensions globally. Of course, now we are at a situation where it's maybe difficult to see how they would still deteriorate more. But unfortunately, I think that this energy transition, as much as we need it, but it will cause these sort of losers and winners, which might then contribute to increasing tension still. Or then within countries, again, we have this sort of the risk that climate mitigation actions, if they are not planned very well and thought out what kind of impacts they have on all groups of the society, then they might cause this sense of inequality and opposition and polarization. So especially when we think about climate and conflict linkages, but I think that this also covers a lot of all of the impacts that I mentioned. We often see these sort of chains of effects, again, where we have climate change, which then leads to human insecurity and resource scarcity. And then it can already directly from there exacerbate conflict or lead to conflict through various again, causal mechanisms, or this human insecurity and resource scarcity can increase the risk of violence or terrorism or other illegal activities, and then this can exacerbate conflict. So very often you create these sort of kind of circles which exacerbate conflict, and then often we also have some research suggesting that conflict, of course, makes it more difficult to mitigate climate change. So then we also have this again, like a circle, that vicious circle, which is very difficult to exit. And here is one concrete example that has been studied quite a lot by several international institutes on the ways in which climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities or risks or poor security situations. And this example is from the Lake Chad, where climate change has caused increasing drought and changes in the lake itself and limited the amount of water resources there. And this, together with already existing overuse of water and land and population growth, has meant that the access and availability of resources has decreased very dramatically. And this in a situation where you already have security challenges like a very present terrorist activity, especially by Boko Haram, but there are other terrorist groups as well, has the potential to feed into these resource conflicts because you have reduced access to resources, which could lead some people, because they don't have any other choices, to be more susceptible to be recruited to terrorist organizations, which then reinforces the terrorist activity and sort of undermines livelihood security again. And this circle then keeps sort of worsening as climate change sort of advances. So we need to find some solutions to get out of these situations and to improve the security situation while also dealing with the challenges of climate change. And this is something that I tried to somehow maybe illustrate here by sort of showing that the climate action in itself has both peace potential, but then also conflict potential. And we can maybe discuss this more later on. But there is this idea that the peace potential of climate action is that you find sort of mutual understanding through climate efforts. But then also, if you impose some sort of very climate insensitive actions, oh, sorry, I've written this wrong. I meant to write in a lack of conflict sensitivity in the very bottom of the slide. But if you impose some very sort of conflict insensitive climate actions, then you might actually end up causing more damage in the region where you're imposing the climate action than really doing anything good. So in a way, there is a clear linkage between climate action and peace building or sustainable peace and conflict sensitivity, but it needs to be very deliberately done. And we need to strengthen this sort of nexus between climate and peace building in order to achieve the results that we want. And I know that I'm running out of time, but I thought that I will still give you some small examples of how this has been implemented in different parts of the world so far. These are just very sort of general examples, and we can discuss them more as well. But some things that have been tried are, for example, bringing climate experts into peace negotiations, where they can sort of inform the peace negotiations participants about the upcoming changes in a specific area and kind of predict and prevent the sort of resource conflicts that might, for example, arise as climate change advances. On the other hand, you should also integrate natural resource governance into peace building so that it is ensured that the natural resources, even as they are maybe becoming more restricted, that they will not be a cause of conflict or somehow revert a peace project over disputes about resources. Then it's also increasingly important to recognize the conflict risks in national climate adaptation and mitigation plans. So this maybe goes a bit to the sort of potential conflict sensitivity of climate mitigation, that you have to recognize the conflict risks even as you are doing the adaptation and mitigation plans. And then finally, you have to promote national and regional this sort of dialogue on climate adaptation in conflict conditions, so that you can, through dialogue, achieve both mutual understanding and climate action. Then I think I'm out of my time, so I will I will stop here, but I'm looking forward to the questions and answers session. So thank you from me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Hakala, for that brilliant presentation on climate security and peace building. We have had a number of issues that have a nexus between climate change and how it is impacting on security. I would implore each one of us who has a question, a clarification, to hold it until we come to the end of the session, once the three presenters have done their presentations. Now, I want to welcome Dr. Njoki Wamai. Dr. Njoki Wamai is going to give us a presentation on gender, climate change, and security in peacekeeping. I want to bring to your attention that Dr. Njoki is an assistant professor at the International Relations Department of the United States International University, Africa. Previously, she was a postdoctoral research associate at the Center of Governance and Human Rights at the University of Cambridge Politics and International Studies Department, where she attained a PhD as a Gates Cambridge Scholar in 2018. While at Gates Scholar, she was awarded a Bill Gates Senior Prize for outstanding scholars who embody the leadership, academic excellence, and social justice goals of the scholarship. Her doctoral research focused on understanding the politics of the International Criminal Court intervention in Kenya. During her postdoctoral associateship, she was a co-convener of a research project on rethinking transitional justice interventions in Africa, along with two Cambridge academics from 2017 to 2018. And she also convened a research seminar on rethinking African studies. She also co-founded a research project known as the Black Cantabs Research Project to celebrate Cambridge alumni of African descent. Our research interests include critical peace and security studies, transitional justice and human rights, intervention in Africa, African feminisms, and politics of knowledge production. I want to welcome Dr. Njoki Wamai to take the stage for the next 15 minutes. Dr. Wamai, over to you.
Hello.
Yes, go on. Unmute. Njoki, you are muted.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Now I can
Yeah,
see.
go on.
Now I can. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Good. Asante very much for the generous introduction. And I would like also to thank you all, especially the International Peace Training Center, for inviting me for this annual meeting. So I don't know whether Martin, are you sharing the screen or I share it?
It'd be easier if you share it, but if you're unable, I can share it.
All right. So as mentioned earlier, I'm speaking about peace, the gender dimensions to climate change and peacekeeping, and what are the considerations for peacekeepers, and also security, and also for security. I think because, of course, climate change, as you all know, is a security issue, a human security issue, and which is one of the main emerging issues that has become, I think, very, very important recently. Good. You can share the screen. Right. Okay, no, there it is. So why should this be important? I think as you've heard even from Emma in the previous presentation, the implications for climate change are many, as you've heard, and why it is so important we consider issues of climate change. I'm going to speak more to the East African, especially to the East African context. As you all know, just before these rains that we are now celebrating right now in East Africa, we had the worst drought in 40 years, and that drought has affected 37 million people. The World Bank by 2030 has already predicted that 86,000 people will be impacted by the rising sea levels and ocean temperatures, amplifying cost of flooding and storm intensity. For those who have been watching closely, you saw the storms and cyclone Idai in Mozambique and Malawi, which had devastating effects. And according to the international, the climate change, the Horn of Africa will experience a 10% decline in rainfall by 2050, which has the potential to cause, of course, mass migration as people move and violence. By 2050, you've seen, and we've had the temperatures in East Africa expected to rise with 1.3 to 2.1 degrees Celsius. And this temperature will cause the region, of course, to become drier. Considerable increases, of course, in animal diseases. Already we've seen diseases like animal diseases, like the there's a disease, even I know a friend of mine even who is researching on that, which animal diseases that have increased because of climate change. And of course, you know what that means: reduction of animal productivity, and it also means reduction on increasing poverty for those who rely on, say, pastoralists, on animals for their livelihoods. And also food security, so reduction in the length of growing season and famines. And we've seen, if those who are from Kenya, the long debate right now on maize, which even affects politics, and that's part of the reason people want to be on the streets, because of, again, the cost of unga, which is the cause of, for those listening from outside, maize meal, for instance, in Kenya is a staple. And so we've had protests because of the rise, as much as, of course, there's a political element to that, but the cost of food, and especially the maize. So all this, there's also women, we have many disasters that climate change is likely to bring, whether it's flooding, famines, fires. You've seen forest fires, and now we have even more forest fires than ever before. And so all these challenges, and then climate change could force 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. So whether it's moving from areas of floods to less flooding areas, moving from farming places that are drier to places they can plant. So when we think about gender, we need to think about how are men, women, and girls, and not just that, we need to also move to that heteronormative understanding of gender, to also thinking about what about people who are not hetero, like LGBTQ. So peacekeeping trends, unfortunately, they've tended to be gender neutral and heteronormative, and there's need for peacekeepers to be aware of these different experiences to better support the diverse experiences of insecurity that is caused by climate change. And it is insecurity of men and women, girls and boys, people living with disability. Can you imagine someone living with disability in terms of floods, or in terms of famine, in terms of forest fires and those kind of things? And LGBTQ, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, the whole queer community. And I know this is new for many of us, but the way we think of gender is reductive, because we only think about gender, we think, oh, okay, it's women's issue. No, gender is all these people that are put out there: men, women, girls, boys, people with disability, LGBTQ, especially LGBTQ, because those are gender identities. So people who are already discriminated in normal times, if we use gender neutral perspectives in thinking through climate change, those people are likely to suffer even more challenges because of the structural inequalities that they find themselves in the context of in terms of their security, even within climate change in their communities, when there is climate change. So when peacekeepers are deployed elsewhere, or if like IPTC that trains peacekeepers, they need to take into consideration gender. How do we mainstream gender so that our peacekeepers can be more effective within a context of climate change and within a context where we want increasing insecurity because of climate change. So gender mainstreaming by peacekeepers in context of climate change is very important because it influences then how women, men, boys, girls, LGBTQ or the queer community experience and contribute to security and also insecurity within that context of climate change. And we are saying that climate change exacerbates existing insecurity of different groups, whether it's women, girls, or queer folk. Framework. So we need a framework, and that's maybe the gist of my argument. I mean, of my presentation. We need a framework to think through gender, climate change, and also peace. So and the way even what the UN Women and other organizations are proposing is we think through what we call an intersectional approach. And an intersectional approach helps us to see how different insecurities, how different approaches meet because of people's different identities. So we need to think through if we are going to be effective, whether it's as peacekeepers or peace builders or peace scholars or the different communities within who are interested in peace. We need increasingly the intersectional approach has gained a lot of traction to be more effective because it considers the various discrimination that different people face, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, especially this gender. People, oh, it's gender, then it's a women's thing. Let's employ a gender focal officer to look at women's issues. No, gender is also men's issues, and we are moving more to intersectional approach. What another the scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw has argued for, and also masculinities, looking at masculinities and femininities, according to scholars like Cornell, which speaks about how, again, experiences of being male, experiences of being female portend to security. So our theoretical framework, I would argue, if we're going to think through how to do peacekeeping better within the context of climate change, we always need to think through an intersectional approach. And this scholar activist called Kimberly Crenshaw, you can see her picture there, talks about understanding the social and political impact of intersecting identities. And that's what intersectionality is about. So while women and girls experience disproportionate impact of climate change at the global level and also at the local level, I mean, the effects are not uniform. So women, say, in big cities like Nairobi, or a big city like Addis, or some other place like Dar es Salaam or Joburg, will experience climate change, or even somewhere I've seen one of our colleagues from Finland, right? So in Reykjavik, or that in Iceland somewhere. So the kind of effect of climate change for a woman in a city somewhere in Beijing is pollution. And the effects it could have, say, on their unborn child, on even their health and stuff, versus another woman somewhere in Tana River district when there are floods, or somewhere in Shibeli, Juba in Somalia. So rural women will experience, but all, whether it's women and also men. So as I said, we need to stop thinking about gender and think about women. It's very reductive. Let's think about an intersectional approach, how men, women, boys and girls, different identities, queer folk, LGBTQ are affected by these insecurities arising from climate change. So looking at climate change through the lens of intersectional feminism, the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. And that's the main thing. How do they operate together? For instance, if you're a woman, you're a woman with disability, and you're a Black woman, and yeah, you're living with disability, and even say you are even queer. What are the challenges during climate change that you're even likely to face? Or an indigenous woman somewhere, Maasai woman. So the various forms of inequality, how they operate each other, and how they exacerbate each other, and how they then bring more risks to this person. So it is clear that climate change risks are acute often for indigenous people, for African people, for Asian, so especially women in rural areas and indigenous communities in Africa and Asia, women and girls, older women, and of course LGBTQ. So you can imagine, like in India, there's a group of people called the Hijras, trans women. They are trans women. They're trans people. Sorry, not trans women, trans people. And within, as much as they used to be regarded as gods in the earlier days, now they're seen as, outcasts or something. So the kind of violence such people are likely to face, or the kind of sacrifices they're likely to be sacrificed, because during the context of climate change, there's scarcity of resources, and that's why people sacrifice. Who can we sacrifice? That's why, like, women and girls will get less food, or they will likely serve themselves less food in the context of little food, So those kind of who are likely even to be sacrificed, throw them out of the community, or don't give them any food, or beat them up or something. So all these challenges. So we need to start thinking from an intersectional perspective. So women and girls with disabilities, migrant women, think of refugee women, like people who are in Kakuma within the context of climate change. They're already discriminated, they're already suffering. What that is likely to be, or like right now, we have Kenyan forces and East African forces in Eastern DRC, displaced women, and there's a lot of displacement of women. What are the challenges? Especially as much as it is a conflict that is not fully on because of climate change, but what are all these things if we look at intersectional approach? And those women living in rural, remote, conflict and disaster-prone areas. And you can see some examples of those kind of how climate change continues to cause more challenges for people who are already living in remote areas. Turkana County, this was before it started raining a month ago or something. But you all know there was a huge drought. There was inadequate rain that pushed people's coping capabilities to the brink. And of course, women always bear. You can see this woman walking with three jerry cans or three to look for water. So women during these cases of climate change will be forced to walk longer distances because it's scarce. Women eat less than men during issues of climate change. What happens if this woman is pregnant and she's eating less than her husband or her sons or her brothers? Of course, she cannot even offer the adequate nutrition for an unborn baby, and the baby is already born with challenges, whether it's diseases or probably with other challenges. Malawi, another recent cyclone we had in 2019, cyclone Idai, or was it Idai? So many girls were married off. So in Malawi, 74 child marriages in camps were recorded as parents traded off their girls to safety for exchange of money. So many parents will trade off their daughters in times of crisis, not necessarily because they hate them. They'll think, oh, if I marry her off, at least she'll have a place where she can eat some food if we are starving because of climate change and all these challenges, or if we have floods like we had in Malawi and Mozambique during Cyclone Idai. But you can see already some researchers documented, or this I think were NGO working in the community, 74 child marriages. So girls were married off by their parents. So that is very, very serious. And of course, 1.85 million people in the 3 different countries needed support, from housing to food to healthcare. So women then become, and especially young girls, become easy to sell off. Somalia also, another case study, which ranks the 4th most gender inequitable country. And most of this challenge, gender inequality has been now exacerbated by climate change, again leading to gender-based violence. So gender-based violence, more than ever before, as we have increased climate change and famine. Before these rains we are talking about, it has recorded increased gender-based violence. And this gender-based violence, of course, is in many types of gender-based, whether it's households, sexual violence, or FGM has even increases during those times, as there's a lot of stress in the community. Women want to conform because of the, there are no resources to culture, tradition. So Somalia's record drought of 2020 killed as many as 43,000 people, and half of them were children under the age of 5, according to a report from UN agencies. And most of this, of course, as we said, will be girls who die, because people are ready to, girls will get less, whether it's food with their moms than boys. Again, people with disability, children even with disability are likely to even more scarcity, less food for them, because it's just too much work. Maybe parents will see that carrying this person with disability who probably doesn't have their own movement. So there are so many challenges, and that's why I'm encouraging consideration for peacekeepers is, let's start using Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectional approach if we're going to be more effective in providing security, not just, of course, not just security as we know it, traditional security, but also helping communities with human security to restore their dignity. As you know, the famous, of course, scholar Amartya Sen on this kind of human security issues, freedom from want, freedom from fear, so food and healthcare and all those things. And now, of course, there's the environment, and that's where we're talking about climate and environmental issues as a security issue, because it's important for a sustainable sustainability. Other case studies on how climate change is intersecting with security from a gender perspective or from an intersectional perspective. In northern Nigeria, you all know, especially northern Nigeria and Chad, and the Chad, many of you, I'm sure you've heard about the crisis we have with Boko Haram and climate change. Lake Chad has reduced, if you check many pictures from the, what do you call it? The 1 minute, Oh my God. Okay, so northern Nigeria, Chad, and North Kordofan, all this, you see norms of masculinity are changing. Please give me 3 minutes, such as the desire to protect families. There's a desire to protect families, and so we have intensified intercommunal farmer-herder conflicts, which motivates young men to join armed groups like Boko Haram, as climate change impact destroys their resource-based livelihoods. And then, of course, with climate change, there's everyday violence in Chad, economic insecurities, which make adolescent girls more vulnerable to early marriage, and young men also are being enlisted to join armed groups. Of course, the Boko Harams, the Mai Mais in eastern DRC. It also drives men to move out, male migration outside of Chad. And that's why many of them will cross this, are even ready to risk their sea to go to Europe. So all this, there's a lot of migration and most of them are quite young men who should be in school. So we need to look at all this, because and we've talked about the many effects of climate change on women and girls, increased poverty. Girls will spend less time in education during climate change issues, because then they have to spend their time foraging for food and water for the family along with their mothers. So as peacekeepers, what do we do if you find this happening? I know peacekeepers a lot of winning hearts and minds. How do we provide water so that girls and do not leave school? They can spend a lot of their time in school. So diseases again, times of this flooding like Cyclone Idai, it's women again who have to go looking for food and water. Maternal mortality, many women because of climate change and this kind of issues, malaria, dengue fever, Zika virus, stillbirths, women are giving birth to stillbirths because of extreme heat. So all these have been seen to be risks associated with climate change. And of course, one of the biggest risks is sexual gender-based violence, and increasingly, especially for those of us with lots of wild animals, human-wildlife conflict, right? So many of these women will find themselves facing gender-based violence, whether it's intimate partner violence because of the increased household tensions and stresses, defilement and child marriages, risks. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop at that.
4 minutes. So can you conclude?
I'll stop
please?
at that.
Just conclude.
Yeah. So also, we've talked about preferences for sons' education when we have less resources and resource stress, and differential feeding for children, coerced sexual exploitation. So I will move. So what should we do as peacekeepers before deployment? I think it's important we study the links, do our soldiers to see the links between gender, climate change, conflict, and security in the deployment area. Let's train, let's map potential climate change risks, local practices and challenges faced by female communities, whether it's pastoralists or farmers, and see what are these gender, and from an intersectional approach, remember, because when we say gender, most of the time we reduce it and we don't really do right to everybody. So also training peacekeepers on the nexus between gender, climate change before deployment, help them shift also their ways of thinking. During peacekeeping, again, it's of course actively seeing those issues we are talking about, girls leaving school, a lot of gender-based violence, conducting evidence-based analysis and research, even when they're in the community, and also helping communities to strengthen their resilience and adaptive capacities to these climate-induced challenges posed by climate change, identifying potential and promising opportunities, and undertaking analysis, especially when you're on the ground, but especially these issues we're talking about human security. In conclusion, climate change crisis is not gender neutral. Women and girls experience the greatest impact of climate change, and not just women and girls, as we said, all other identities, queer identities, and people with disabilities, which amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, their health, and their safety. So peacekeepers need to understand these risks for different groups so that they can work with communities to mitigate these risks of climate change, both in the short term and in the long term. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you, Doc, for that presentation. We have learned a number of things about gender, climate change, and security in peacekeeping. The gender is very central towards ensuring a holistic approach towards peacekeeping. That's all genders indeed must be involved in matters peacekeeping, and they must take into consideration the issues around climate change, because it basically exacerbates the effects of conflicts. It makes them worse. You know, that word is very difficult to pronounce. We live to fight another day. I want to say thank you for that, and subsequently invite our third speaker before we go to the plenary. That is Clifford Collins Omondi. Clifford Collins Omondi, if I say a few things about him, he's going to present to us a paper on environmental security. What can the EU and the US strategies, what do these strategies mean to the Horn of Africa countries? So Omondi Okwanyi is a research fellow at RAAD Peace Research Institute. His research work is based in the Horn of Africa. He's also an expert in international security and foreign policy, focusing on ontological security, conflicts and violence theories, such as frontier and spatial theory. More specifically, researching on counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, radicalization, de-radicalization, community-based armed groups, and non-state armed groups. He has been part of the European Union Horizon 2020 research project on community policing as part of the team for the African Package Group. So I want to give you this opportunity, Mr. Collins, for the next 15 minutes for you to take us through your presentation, and then we shall transit to a plenary. Welcome, Mr. Collins.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm not sure if I can be allowed to share my presentation, or someone can help me to share it.
I can help you share it because I have a copy of it.
All right. Or I can also do it if possible from my end. But you can, Martin, you can help me share the presentation.
Yes, yes.
So that, as Martin is helping us to share this presentation, I just want to say that my talk is going to focus on main three angles. Number one, the talk is going to focus on environmental security, that is theoretical concerns that are related to environment and security. And then after the theoretical concerns, I'm going to give a talk on different institutions. And these institutions are the European Union and the US strategy. Yeah.
Can you share your video? And I ask all the presenters, please share your videos to allow us to take a photo for our social handles for IPSTC. So if you can kindly share your videos.
I think my video is on. So I'm not sure if you can.
No, it's not on.
Okay, but I think it's because the video is shared. I can see myself. I'm not sure. I can see you. I can see Martin, and I can see myself. I don't know.
Your camera.
Yes, it's on.
You can proceed.
Okay, thank you. What I was saying is that this talk is focused on three angles. Number one, theoretical concerns, which is environment, the nexus between environment and security. And then number two, I'm going to talk about European Union, that is the strategies of European Union in the Horn of Africa. And then number three, I'm going to talk about the US strategies in the Horn. So looking at how these strategies focus on climate change and environment and security. So to start us off, maybe the introduction part, as the two presenters have clearly said, so I will not really dwell on introducing climate change and conflict. But Martin, if you can go to the next slide, please. You find that, of course, indeed, there's a great connection. Some of you who are very keen on environment and conflict, you would recall the Kuwait war, the Gulf War, which led to some environmental issues in the Persian Gulf. So you can see here there's a connection between climate and conflict. Again, whenever there is conflict, such as what we're having in Sudan, you would find that there is a huge migration, which affects the environment as well. Many of us, the Ukraine war, Ukraine crisis has been discussed, is being discussed all over. And you would see that this crisis is affecting, for example, it's affecting the higher grain prices in the Horn of Africa. So a sort of food security in the Horn, despite the war is far away from the Horn of Africa. So there's indeed a connection between climate change and security. One puzzling point is that despite this connection, you find that international regimes such as United Nations Framework on UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Security Council, if you look at their strategies on climate, is not connecting. There's no connection between this organization, yet the UN Security Council has strategies on climate. And the leading organization within the UN on climate is not connected to the UN Security Council. And this goes to other institutions such as the World Trade Organization and so on. So despite the fact that climate or environment and security are connected, these institutions are not that connected. So the Horn of Africa is facing a lot of security challenges currently. The war between RSF and SAF in Sudan is likely to escalate to Libya and even Chad. And with Ethiopia is also having the Tigray war, which the border between Ethiopia and Sudan is a critical area where you will find a lot of conflict and migration there, and refugees always affect this environment because they move in numbers, and therefore it's a state security, but also it's an environmental challenge. So as we shall see, let me first of all dive into the theoretical concerns so that before I get into the European Union strategies. You would find that environmental concerns started, research on environmental concern came strongly in the 1990s. Those of us who are interested in security, you will recall the Copenhagen School, which introduced environmental security. They shifted from the traditional security, which is state national interest and militarization, and they came up with different aspects of security. So environmental security becomes the ultimate security. It's the final security because it's about survival. So if you, for example, those of us who are aware of the frontier in the Horn, such as northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia, you would find that these communities are affected by droughts, they are affected by floods. Currently it's raining in northern Kenya. So it's about survival. So the extreme floods since 2019, it has not been raining that much in northern Kenya. So these communities face a lot of challenges when it comes to survival. So there's security, on the other hand, is the absence of threat. The state sees security as an absence of threat, trying to remove the threat. But again, security, the Copenhagen School of Thought tells us that we can't define security as absence of threat. So, for example, the government, the Kenyan government tries to win, to come up with green energy in Olkaria. You know, there's potential in the Suguta Trough. There's potential of geothermal in Nakuru, Menengai. There's potential in Suswa. But you find that despite these projects are coming in these areas, they risk the livelihood of these pastoralist communities. So for the pastoralists, it's about survival. So if it's about survival, then it's you define security as absence of fear. And then for the government, it's about the national interest. You want to remove threat. So there's a contestation between the absence of fear and the absence of threat. So to dive into the EU strategies, looking at the environmental security in the Horn of Africa, if you can go to the next, yes, thank you. You find that the EU has different strategies within the Horn of Africa. Main conventional philosophy of EU is strongly rooted into solving climate change issues, climate neutral EU. And the EU has different proxy engagements. So EU is not directly involved, but you find that they have proxy missions within the Horn of Africa. For example, there is EU national naval forces, which is giving capacity building to the Horn of African countries on how to man the maritime security, because the Horn has different challenges when it comes to maritime security, and the Indian Ocean is critical. It's a very critical maritime route when it comes to trade and interest of different countries. Therefore, the EU is offering capacity building to these Horn of African countries in order to safeguard the Indian Ocean. Again, you find that these Horn of African countries, they have weak naval powers. For example, if you look at the international requirement, countries are supposed to guard about 200 nautical miles. The capacity of Kenyan naval powers can only reach 5 nautical miles. So you find there's a challenge, and there are vultures within the Indian Ocean, which is fishing. And the former Uhuru Kenyatta regime also said that Kenya is losing a lot of money in the ocean. So, and there's also dumping. So EU is trying to come up with these strategies on how to empower these countries within the Horn to man or to guard the blue ocean. Apart from that, EU has, for example, EU has a partnership with countries such as Kenya on geothermal energy through the EU Investment Bank, investing in geothermal in Kenya. And there's also potential geothermal in Ethiopia and so on. So these strategies EU strategies are more focused on climate and environmental security. So you find that the diplomacy EU is bringing in the Horn of Africa is centered on climate neutrality, trying to identify how to be climate neutral in terms of their different strategies in the Horn. But if we turn to the US has a different, more or less, or different strategy. Martin, if you can go to the next slide, please. So you find that the United States has 3 strategies in the Horn of Africa. And these 3 strategies is the National Defense Strategy, there is the National Security Strategy, and the strategy towards Sub-Saharan country. And if you dig deep into the 2 strategies, that is the National Defense Strategy and National Security Strategy, these strategies hardly mention Africa. they mention Africa in a very small line. So the Biden administration strategies, these two strategies hardly mention Africa. But if you look at the sub-Saharan strategy, it's focused so much on climate change as a climate diplomacy. So Biden tries to dig into the Horn of Africa with these strategies, trying to solve climate change issues. And again, you find that the Biden administration is facing different challenges in the Horn, because currently these American strategies, Ethiopia is hardly mentioned, because Ethiopia has, the current war in Ethiopia and the current challenges Ethiopia is facing. Eritrea also has a very, the relationship between Eritrea and the US is not as good. So Uganda is also facing out. So you find that the Biden administration focused so much on Kenya. Kenya is the entry of the US, for example, in the Horn of Africa. And the current situation in Sudan tells us that the Red Sea is very important, because you find that there are naval forces within the Djibouti waters, and therefore, and when Russia came into a relationship with Sudan, then you can see that there is some international contestation within the Horn, and the Horn becomes very, very, very important. If you look at these strategies again, the United States strategies, as much as it focuses on climate change, long are gone the issues of US strategies in solving terrorism. The Al-Qaeda days are all gone. Despite this, terrorism is still a critical issue, but the US focus in the Horn of Africa so much is about countering China and countering Russia. So these US strategies are more into countering these other international powers. Because as we all know,
time is
21
spent already. Kindly focus on winding up.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So you find that these strategies are more on countering this. It's a more of a counter of these other powers which are coming in the Horn. So the Horn of Africa becomes a very interesting focus. If you go to my last slide, please, then I'll just wind up. So, so what is going on in the Horn? There are definitely challenges and opportunities for both EU and the US, especially when it comes to environmental diplomacy and climate diplomacy. However, there are also other powers coming in, such as China. China is coming in with economic aspect, and also Russia has started coming in. Ethiopia and Ethiopia has just went into some agreement with Russia in 2021. Sudan is also having some naval power agreement with Russia in the Red Sea. So they can be opportunities or challenges depending on how you see them. So I will end there, and then I will expound more in the question time. Thank you so much for letting me present. Asante.
Thank you, Mr. Okwanyi, for that good presentation. Various strategies and policies have been alluded to, and I know in the audience we have attendees who would like to be enlightened on one or two things. So I want us to transit to a plenary of about 20 minutes. That is a question and answer. And I want to ask the audience to pose their questions to the three panelists who have just left the floor. And just ask one question if you do not ask more than one question as a person, just one question for the interest of time. I can't see any hands, but even before I see hands, I have a question to our first presenter, Dr. Hakala. Dr. Hakala, you were talking about climate security and peace building. I was wondering, why did you limit yourself to peace building? And yet we have a whole spectrum of peace and security activities, whereby we have conflict prevention, we have peacemaking, we have peace enforcement, we have peace building. You limited yourself to the tail end on probably post-conflict peace building.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's a very good question. And I should have definitely made it more clear in my presentation, maybe introduced the terms that I'm using. I think that I was kind of using peace building, and I would say mistakenly, as a sort of a how do you say, like an umbrella term for all the peacekeeping, peace building activities. And I think this was mostly for the sake of time. But it's very true that the different parts of the peace process, if you will, require like very different activities, and in all of those the climate component comes in. So I think that if I had maybe had the chance to go more into the details of the processes and the specific actions, then this would have been a very important point to make and to elaborate a bit more. So thanks for that remark.
Okay. Any questions from the floor and clarifications on the three presentations?
Maybe somebody, if you have a question, you can type it on the chat.
Yes, Lillian. Lillian, I can see you want to ask a question. Lillian Torome. Go on.
Let me enable a mic, Prof. Doc. Lillian, you can ask a question. Lillian, I have enabled your mic so you can ask your question, or you can type it in.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. My question is on the China's strategy on peace security in Africa. Do you feel that whatever they are doing in terms of assisting in infrastructure development is more sustainable? And is it an approach that maybe superpowers can also adapt, seeing as it is that China is now becoming a superpower on its own?
Yes, that is to Mr. Omondi. Could you respond briefly?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, proceed.
I think as if you look at Chinese strategies, you would find that Chinese strategies in the Horn of Africa is more focused on economy, the economic aspect. So, for example, we are having the China is having a partnership with Kenya in building the Lamu port. So, and even different other parts of Africa, Ethiopia has different aspect of economic aspect with China. But as I said in my talk, the focus of the US has been more, if you look at this strategies has been more of environmental diplomacy and also national interest of the US. And then China becomes China is part of that strategy. So US is trying to win this Horn of African countries in terms of environmental diplomacy. But Chinese is more focused on economic aspect, which has different implications as well, in terms of climate. If Lapset, the dream of Lapset, for example, that is Lamu Port, South Sudan transport corridor, goes to the northeastern Kenya, it will have environmental implications because it will change organized violence in these areas. So there will be strong state security, which will affect the pastoralist communities, because they are already stressed with environmental issues. So with development coming into the Horn, the frontier of the Horn, it means these communities are going to be threatened. So climate change is environmental security is a very critical aspect when it comes to this development and economic development as well. Thank you. I hope I answered your case.
Lillian, are you answered?
Yes, but I feel that they are now, I feel like now China is becoming more active as opposed to the past. They are now getting into peace support. So we cannot overlook and say that it is more of economic, yet I think they feel like that they are also contributing to peace support.
Yeah, in addition to what you've said, Lillian, is any country that wants to stamp authority in the international arena, even if they started as under the economic model in terms of their foreign policy and activities, eventually they want to be seen in terms of military strength. So it just starts with, the economic model and then eventually transits to the security model. I see Jedida. Yes, you have a question?
Let me enable a mic.
Okay. Jedida?
I have enabled her mic.
Thank you, Daktari. I
Proceed.
have a question. I don't really know who to direct the question to. The question of climate change is a question which is majorly discussed by the elites, those people who are up there, the knowledgeable group, just the way we are doing right now. But the people who are feeling the impact are the common man. There's a group which doesn't, is not even aware of what is called climate change. So my question is, how has the government or how has this elite group helped to make sure that the question of climate change has been discussed and has been known to the common man, these people who don't know what is even climate change? Thank you.
Okay, Judita, thank you. In one paragraph, Dr. Njoki and Dr. Hakala, you will respond to that question. Just a paragraph, each of you. Thank you.
The speaker about keys in climate change, COP19, but COP is the change. Of course, first is discussions at the top.
Dr. Njoki, you are breaking.
The people at the bottom agree, yes, then. increasingly a sentiment heard
Dr.
by
Wamai,
most of
Dr. Wamai, your transmission is intermittent. It's breaking.
Okay,
We
then.
can't get you quite well. Yes.
My I think the next speak right in the chat.
Yeah, please do write on it on the chat. Dr. Hakala, could you respond, please?
Yes,
If your internet is good.
I hope so. Thank you. And yes, please, Dr. Wamai, write in the chat because I'm really interested in hearing the answer. And I was going to say something about the COP meetings, but I will not because I think that Dr. Wamai was mentioning that. But I think that there have been, for example, attempts to organize all kinds of dialogues and discussions among sort of the ordinary people by several organizations, where the idea is to bring people together and to discuss the climate impacts that they are already experiencing, and then maybe to find some solutions to what they could do to deal with those. Of course, that always still reaches a very small number of people. And I don't think that enough has been done. I mean, the discussion is a very elite discussion, but maybe through these small actions we could achieve something at least, I hope.
Thank you, Doc. Now, I would weigh in and say that this conversation is no longer an elite preserve. I know even in Kenya, as we speak, the president did inaugurate or promulgate a process whereby everyone is now required to plant trees. And this is in response to the climate change effects. I was in my upcountry, I received about 21 trees to plant. So I do not think, Jadida, as you put it, that it is anymore an elite affair, but governments are concerned that everyone must get this information to be able to contribute positively towards ameliorating the effect of climate change, because they are evident. You can see the rains that are raging right away as we speak in some parts of the country and the world. Indeed, you heard about Rwanda. Even the common mwananchi now knows there is a problem. And so everyone must put effort towards trying to resolve this problem. I know that discussion can go on and on, but I would like to put it to the end for the interest of time, and allow us, does anyone have a burning question? I can only allow one more question if there is a burning one. Evan Solo, yes, I can see you have a burning question. Evans Olo. Martin, can you enable his mic?
Hello, everyone. I am
Yes.
Olo Evans from the University of Nairobi. And I would like to channel my question to Dr. Njoki Wamai with regards to gender and climate change dimensions to peacekeeping and security. In the past, you've seen most of the multinational organizations starting up projects, especially in the Northern Rift, where there's been an issue with food security, by initiating certain projects that would encourage plants that are more semi-arid resistant. But to some certain extent, I feel as if much is not being done, especially with regards to curbing the issues from the root. An instance will be in northern Kenya, as it is right now, there's an issue with cattle rustling, and it's been something that has been prevailing for quite a while. From assessing some of the issues that are being raised from this cattle rustling, it's basically because of climate change, things to do with pasture, So there's like this scramble for places to come and graze and all that. But it is as if there is so much focus. Yes.
That is too long.
There is so much focus on
the point.
Yes. Pardon. Do you think
Kindly go to the question.
Perhaps what are some of the strategies that you think the multinational organizations and the governments can take towards curbing some of these issues?
Dr. Wamai, in a paragraph, please.
Now. Hello?
Yes, proceed.
I will just say a lot climate change and government. In fact, I'm most active this on COP, challenging governments for pollution. There's a lot.
Again, Dr. We can't get you. Just type the answer. I'm going to read the one you typed here, and you did say that I was responding that I agree with the question asked, that there is a lot of focus on the policymakers on climate change, especially with COP conferences, but there is a lot of efforts to love from elite climate change conferences to local meetings and practices. I think I already alluded to that. Somebody by the name Dennis Muniu, directing a question to Dr. Hakala, and he is asking, what role has the AU played in advancing the climate security nexus debate in Africa? In your view, is it enough? If not, what can they do? In a statement, Dr. Hakala.
Well, I guess to put it very briefly, I'm also not an expert, I would say, on the African Union, but I think that it is a discussion that has been picking up, and they have started to work on it and have some approaches. I actually know that there are some publications on this, so maybe I can put them in the chat later on. But maybe the issue is that still at the level of sort of tangible policy making, not enough is happening, and maybe the resources for this topic are not quite enough. But the discussion at least has been started at the EU.
Thank you, Daktari. Now, in response to your question, Olo, Dr. Wamai says that in Kenya and other countries, of course, they are making efforts to tree planting and other efforts being made, such as carbon credits from the Western governments. So you can see there is already a conversation going on. It may not be enough to eyes of some, but once the train has left station, eventually it will arrive somewhere. So we look forward to better conversations and actions being taken effectively to overcome this challenge. I want to hand over this program briefly for a break to Lisa Sigei. She has a documentary for IPSTC. She's going to share it. We watch, and then we proceed to session 2. Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you, Doc. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Sigei. From the Public Affairs Department here at the International Peace Support Training Center. So before we dive into the documentary, I'd like all of us to partake in a small exercise. I'd like almost 60 of us to turn on our cameras for a photo. If you're in a position to, please do that. Okay, more people, please.
Dr. Jenna Russo, turn on your camera, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Sorry about that. I had a glitch for just a moment. Please allow me to share my screen.
No.
Dr. Jenna, just a minute.
We are not there yet.
Sorry, I lost you for a
photo.
minute, so I apologize.
Yeah, we
Okay,
are.
no problem.
We are transiting to session 2 after watching some
Yeah.
clip that is going to be shared. But before then, we asked you turn on your cameras. Thank you for those who got the message. Lisa, to you.
All right. I don't know if that's everybody that we could manage to get. Just a minute.
And smile.
Please smile.
I should ask Samuel Mbutu to smile.
One more.
Okay.
I can see new people have joined, so let's just take one last one, and then we transit to the video. All right, thank you so much. So we'll play a small documentary, a 1-minute documentary that will just give you an overview of what IPSTC is and what we do. Martin?
Okay, thank you. I'm sharing it right now. All right, thank you. Now back to my boss, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Major Doc. Please, yours.
Good. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Martin and Elisa. Now we transit to our second session, and we have 2 speakers for this session. That is Mr. Samuel Mbutu and Dr. Jenna Russo. Is it Russo or Rasso?
It's Russo. You had it correct.
Russo. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to say a few things about Mr. Mbutu and Dr. Russo. Mr. Samuel Mbutu is a PhD candidate in political science and public administration at the University of Nairobi. He is also a lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Nairobi. He is an alumnus of Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, with a BA in Political Science, Economics, and Psychology. He is also a holder of a master's degree in International Relations and Diplomacy from the University of Nairobi. Mr. Mbutu, you should find time and, explore what other universities are doing. You are only dealing with the University of Nairobi. It's fine. His areas of specialization are in political economy, diplomacy, conflict resolution, security, regional integration, and policy. He's also a political commentator on national issues in the leading media houses and national dailies. He has published widely on regional and global politics. I want to invite you, Mr. Mbutu Samuel Mararo, to present your paper. On exploring the intersection of climate change and security in peacekeeping operations. And your paper is the Eastern African Community and Mitigation of Climate Change, Progress or Ongoing in Circles. It's a question you are asking. I hope by the end of your presentation and the plenary discussions, we shall be able to respond to this question. Welcome, Mr. Samuel. The floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Fine. I want to strictly adhere to the 15 minutes. Thank you so much, moderator. First and foremost, allow me to convey the cordial greetings from the University of Nairobi fraternity. With me here, I have a delegation of 40 students. So IPSTC, we are grateful for this opportunity. They have learned so much and we are willing to cooperate with you more so that we can do a lot for the society. As the University of Nairobi, we have always played the lead role in matters environmental conservation and mitigation of climate change, and our impact is there for everybody to see. So coming back to my paper, I think I will share and
It's okay. I can share it from my end. So as you continue the presentation, just tell me to go to the next slide because I have a presentation.
All right.
There.
Okay, there we go. In the modern world, there are things which any sovereign state cannot do without collaborating with other neighboring sovereign states. And when it comes to matters climate change, these are some of the challenges which Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, or Burundi cannot sufficiently mitigate on their own. They need closer working collaboration with their neighboring states. And that explains why in the year 2004, the East African community saw the need to take the lead and to guide member states on what are some of these long-lasting mitigation measures they can use or they can adopt in order to effectively respond to the disastrous effects of climate change. The East African community came up with a master plan in which all these member states can adopt so that they can mitigate, they can respond and try to make at least lives better for their citizens as a response measure to the challenges they were encountering from these effects of climate change. However, there came some element of sovereignty in which some member states felt that they could not be directed or be guided by the East African community, which is not even a Leviathan. So for that reason, the master plan or the East African community climate change policy has never been implemented to the full. And that explains why the disastrous effects of climate change are hitting the East African countries hard. When we compare what the European Union is doing in the continent of Europe, it has taken a lead role, and it has given out measures, policy guidelines, which every member state in the European Union is compelled to adhere to. And for that reason, in Europe, the disastrous effects of climate change have been to a greater extent mitigated. And therefore, the citizens of Europe, and I think Jenna Russo and Hakala can testify, they are actually not paying the heaviest price like citizens in the Horn of Africa or within the East African community are paying that heavy price. So can we move to the second slide, Martin? Now, there is a problem here. National policies in response to climate change vis-a-vis the regional policies. What is the right thing for states to do? Is it to go by national policies? Is it to go with the regional policies? That is one of the biggest debates which each member state within the East African community is experiencing. Secondly, the challenge of turning peacekeeping operations into avenues in which they can advance the climate change policy which has been adopted by the East African community. When you move to the third slide, Martin, you will see the map of the Horn of Africa region. And in the Horn of Africa region, you will realize that most of the countries are experiencing what we call internal civil strife. They are either having internal conflicts, that those are intrastate conflicts, or interstate conflicts, majority of which have got their background in the disastrous effects of climate change. In the Republic of Somalia, for instance, since the year 1991, they have never had any form of stability. And for that reason, there have been so many peacekeeping operations, and ATMIS, that is the African Transition Mission in Somalia, is the current peacekeeping operation in that country. And almost every member state in the East African community has contributed their troops. So as much as the troops from the East African member states are in Somalia under the auspices of ATMIS, they are also pursuing state-centric interests of these East African member states, which among those state-centric interests are matters of climate change. So the question then is, are these peacekeeping operations under ATMIS, are they actually playing their role in advancing the agenda of mitigating the disastrous effects of climate change? Or are they contradicting what they are supposed to do? For instance, we've had allegations that most of our peacekeeping operations in Somalia have been turned into a charcoal business, whereby they are destroying forests and water catchment areas in Somalia as they engage in charcoal business. Now, for us, of course, those allegations have not been proven, but one thing we know in these developing countries, for us to get news, they always begin as rumors. Then those rumors are denied. At the end of it all, the chicken come home to roost. Now, DRC has also formally joined. You can move to the next slide, Martin. Has also applied to join the East African community. We all know that the Democratic Republic of Congo is the only African country which is blessed to have all the natural resources, beginning with forests, which act as the biggest water catchment area for this region. In fact, the Nile Basin conflict, which is also another resource-based conflict, it stems from the manner in which the natural resources are being destroyed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And for us in the East African community, we've picked a lot of interest in the DRC because we know, one, it will expand our markets. Two, it will help us to tap into these natural resources to our advantage. And one way in which these resources will serve our own good is that when we have these natural resources in DRC well protected, it will help us to solve our water problem in the Horn of Africa region. And for the East African community, those countries such as South Sudan, a section of Uganda, 53% of Kenyan land, which is actually arid or semi-arid, we can have this supplement, food supplements from DRC. And therefore, we have a very big interest in the manner in which natural resources and water catchment areas in DRC are protected. And that explains why the ongoing peace operations in the DRC, namely the EACRF, the East African Community Regional Force, it is not only there to keep peace, but also to sensitize the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo to actually find ways and means in which they will conserve their natural resources. But that cannot be achieved in an environment which is not peaceful. So because I have my 15 minutes, I will simply move to my findings. And these are my findings. One, the East African community has got one of the best climate change mitigation strategies in the world. In fact, when you compare the mitigation strategies in the world, for instance, that one of the United States of America, that of the EU, and that of the East African community, the East African community actually has the best climate change mitigation strategies. However, the only challenge lies with the implementation. Number one, member states are not actually cooperating with the East African community. They are choosing to implement what we call domestic climate change mitigation policies, but they are ignoring this East African community master plan. Number two, this study has established that unless the East African community member states make a conscious decision to do things jointly as a response measure to the disastrous effects of climate change, they are actually doomed. Because there are natural resources which cut across the boundaries of these East African member states. And unless you adopt a common approach in managing these natural resources such as the Masai Mara, the Lake Victoria, the Mount Elgon Forest, and many others. At the end of the day, it is these countries which will have everything to lose. Another finding of my study of my paper is that the peacekeeping operations which have been sanctioned by the East African community, for instance, the EACRF in the DRC, and the East African community member states troops who are in Somalia under the auspices of ATMIS, the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia. They are actually not doing enough. And it is high time, because these peacekeeping operations are multidimensional in nature, which has brought together the military officers, the security agencies, and the civilians. They should consider going for some element of retreat and change their tactics, so that instead of just focusing on maintaining peace, they should also focus on issues such as environmental protection, sensitization of local communities, protection of these water towers in those areas where they are keeping peace. And the end result is that we shall be able to meaningfully respond to the disastrous effects of climate change. Then, another area of concern to us, especially the IPSTC, we need to consider bringing in more players, all right? And IPSTC has begun the conversation. We need this conversation to be expanded to counties, because some of these water catchment areas are in the counties, and these county governments have every role to play. Similarly, in those peacekeeping operations, let them not just concentrate in one area. They should consider dispersing themselves to other areas which have got the potential, to act as water catchment areas and water towers. Finally, sensitization of the general public. Wana Brigadier or Mr. Director, it is true that actually today, the discussion on peace and matters to do with climate change and the mitigation measures are not only elite driven, but they have actually been turned around to be people centered. But you see, we need to do more. A lot of populations in these East African community member states are actually in the villages, and a good number of them cannot access TV stations, newspapers, internet. They rely on vernacular radio stations. So, to all those peacekeeping operations under the auspices of the East African community, they should consider partnering with those local villagers. Yes, those local villagers, and using these vernacular radio stations to propagate the gospel of environmental protection, protection of the water catchment areas, as well as promotion of what we call environmental sanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Mbutu. That was passionate and very nice. That is why I kept a little bit silent to allow you make the point. But later on, I know you are going to withdraw the statement on charcoal burning in Somalia, because those are still allegations, and a scholar is not allowed to to quote allegations. All right, thank you for that. I want to proceed with our final speaker. And our final speaker is none other than Dr. Jenna Russo. Dr. Jenna Russo is a director of research at the International Peace Institute, IPI, in New York, and head of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations. Dr. Russo completed her PhD in political science with a focus on protection of civilians in armed conflict setup. Prior to joining IPI, Dr. Russo spent more than 10 years working as a consultant to the United Nations with a focus on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. She has also done training in peacekeeping and also a project manager in the Office of the Secretary General. As you can see, she is very highly placed and she is definitely an authority in this area. She's going to present to us a paper on climate security advisors in United Nations peace operations. I welcome you, Dr. Russo, to take the stage for the next 15 minutes. To you.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. And it looks like, Martin, if it's okay, I'll have you share the presentation for me, as my settings don't seem to be quite ready for that. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to IPSTC for having me here for this very important conversation. And indeed, climate has become very central to our work on peace operations and peace and security more broadly. I'm going to base most of my comments today on some research we did last year, as was mentioned, on the role of the Climate Security Advisor in UN peace operations, which was first deployed to the UN mission in Somalia, UNSOM, in 2020, and has been subsequently deployed to several other UN mission settings. My comments today will focus a bit on how this role has been envisaged within UN peace operations settings, some of the successes and challenges, and then opportunities for growth and replication, maybe not only in UN settings, but perhaps also in missions that are led by regional and sub-regional organizations as well. One of the main points I'd like to make in this presentation is that in spite of the fact that we see some continued contestation among some member states as to the UN Security Council's role in addressing climate security, when it comes to innovating and institutionalizing the UN's role in addressing climate security within peace operations settings, this has continued to grow at a rather rapid rate over the last couple of years. Slide 2, please. As many of you probably know, contexts where the UN has peace operations are among those that are most affected by climate change. And today I'll use Somalia as the example, and Somalia is of course no exception to this. Somalia is experiencing climate change and environmental degradation quite severely, including floods and multiple failed rainy seasons leading to famine and loss of livelihood. It also has one of the largest populations of IDPs, representing more than 18% of its population. And in addition, armed groups, including Al-Shabaab, have taken advantage of these challenges to boost recruitment and have weaponized access to resources. In some cases, scarcity of resources has exacerbated tension within and between communities, and the state has been unable to respond effectively as a service provider to the high level of need. So in light of these challenges, in 2020, UNSOM became one of the first political missions to have climate-related language in its mandate. Next slide, please. And here I'd like to illustrate the fact that even though the UN Security Council has not been able to come to an agreement on a thematic resolution on climate and security, climate is included in the language of a number of different UN peace operations, including peacekeeping and special political missions. Now, the type of language that's included in these mandates is often similar in wording, and it's modeled after Resolution 2349 pertaining to the Lake Chad Basin, which was passed in 2018 following a Security Council visit to the region. And I think this is important because another point I'd like to make is that very often, in spite of how actors might have political ideologies, when they witness the profound effects that climate change and environmental degradation are having on communities and missions and mandate implementation, this sometimes becomes difficult for policymakers to ignore, and it can in fact incite action on their behalf. And so this is one of the reasons why action on climate security in peacekeeping has progressed, despite political tension, is because of the urgency of the issue has become undeniable. So as you can see in the chart, quite a few UN missions have mandated language on climate in the what we call the preambular section of the mandate, which is the introductory paragraphs. In particular, this language often recognizes the adverse effects of climate change and emphasizes the need for adequate risk assessment and risk management strategies by the government and/or the UN. Now, some missions, fewer, have climate-related language in the operational sections of their mandates. Most often, this is related to missions considering the environmental impact of the mission presence. But in two cases, including Iraq and Somalia, the mandates of the missions instruct the mission to support or assist the government and/or the UN country team on issues related to climate change. And in South Sudan, it mandates the mission to assess the risks of climate change in the operational paragraphs of the mandate. So as I mentioned, UNSOM, the UN mission in Somalia, received this language, but at the time, the mission really didn't have the capacity that it needed in order to implement this part of the mandate. And so because of that, mission leaders worked with the UN Environmental Program, UNEP, to establish an advisory post within the mission to provide technical capacity on climate and to focus on integrating a climate lens throughout the mission's work. Next slide, please. So UNEP, working in partnership with the mission, developed the terms of reference for the position, and it used extra budgetary funding provided by Germany's Federal Foreign Office. And the position was officially seconded by UNEP to UNSOM in 2020. The advisor sits in the office of the Deputy SRSG, who is also the resident coordinator. So for any of those who are unfamiliar with kind of the structures of UN peace missions, the DSRSG and resident coordinator is also in charge of coordinating all of the entities that are part of the UN country team. And so because the advisor sits in this office, that allows them to coordinate well with the whole UN country team that is present within the country. Now, as you can see on this chart, the climate advisor's work in UNSOM is organized around 3 pillars, and I'll just explain them very briefly. So the first pillar is about mainstreaming climate into the mission's mandated areas of work, including its peace building and stabilization tasks, and then mitigating climate-related risks to mandate implementation. So for example, you could imagine that if resource scarcity or environmental degradation is affecting tensions between and among armed groups, this might make it more difficult to support a political process. And so they're really working to try to identify what the climate-related risk factors are and see how they can mitigate those so that mandate implementation becomes more possible. They're also undertaking support to environmental mediation approaches. Now, for those of you that have studied mediation and peace operations, you know that helping to mediate between groups on natural resources is not a new area of mission work. But what is new is kind of the way that this is being framed. So when they're undertaking environmental mediation, what they try to do is address climate change as a joint area of collaboration between communities that might otherwise have tension. So in other words, it views it as a mutual antagonist so that those otherwise conflicting communities can be brought together and working together toward a common good in order to try to help promote sustainable peace. On pillar 2, This pillar is to coordinate among both UN and non-UN actors working on climate-related issues. So the number of actors within Somalia that have some role in addressing climate is quite large. So there are more than 24 members of the UN country team alone, plus the national ministries, local CSOs, etc., who have some role in this. So part of the role of the advisor is just to try to bring these actors together and put them in dialogue with one another. In Somalia, the work is around the triple nexus approach, which some of you may be familiar with, and this works to bring together humanitarian, development, and peace responses. And then finally, pillar 3 is to support the Somali government's efforts to develop and implement its own national policies and frameworks related to climate adaptation. So this is done in collaboration with UNDP, and it includes, for example, the national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions as part of the Paris agreements. If you go to the next slide, you see just a picture of one of the areas of work that they're working on. This is under pillar 2 and this triple nexus approach. So in some cases, they work to combine what they call green and gray construction to try to come up with adaptation and sustainable solutions to climate change. One of the reasons why the climate advisor has been so important is that this type of approach requires not only sort of a highly technical and scientific understanding of climate and climate adaptation, but also really an awareness of the peacekeeping context, the security situation, the potential for armed conflict, and how mission planning works. So it's really a unique and diverse set of skills that is required. And sometimes these skills may not be present within more nascent national institutions. Next slide, please. So I'll very quickly discuss some of the successes and challenges that we've seen in this role so far. Overall, when I interviewed individuals from the mission and different parts of the UN, the role of the climate security advisor was very well received, and there's a sense that they have been able to make some traction over the past couple of years. Though, of course, some of these initiatives are slow in process and they do take time to develop. One of the reasons why the advisor has been able to be successful is in the mission is because there has been real buy-in on the part of mission leadership, as well as those within the national government. So there's been a lot of buy-in amongst counterparts. Now, this is, of course, not guaranteed in other mission settings, but the fact that you have a national counterparts who are very invested in this and the mission, that has worked well. The advisor has also helped to advance evidence-based approaches to climate, and this is where that science and data piece has become really important. And according to one UN official I interviewed prior to the time of the advisor, many of the interventions that they were undertaking in Somalia happened without proper analysis in terms of the scientific implications, and thus were unsuccessful. So bringing in a more data-driven scientific approach to climate security has helped to promote more sustainable initiatives, including mobilizing funding for longer-term development in addition to short-term humanitarian response. A lot of climate response is slow and long-term. And mobilizing funding around that from donors can be quite difficult because they often tend to prefer short-term, high-impact projects so that they could see the gains on those projects very quickly. But that doesn't solve the long-term sustainability problem. And then finally, the advisor has worked very explicitly to include the voices of local community members, a point that was raised earlier, who are, of course, best positioned to understand their own local contexts and what forms of adaptation are best suited for their individual communities. Now, the success in Somalia has led to similar posts being established in the UN missions in Mali, South Sudan, and the regional offices in Central Africa and West Africa and the Sahel. Next slide, please. On the challenges side, one of the biggest challenges that we see is that this is a tremendous amount of work to be coordinated and led by a single individual. When you think about the actual implementation of the projects, the coordination role, thinking about risk within the mission, and again, this is one position in the mission. Also, the number of hats that they have to wear means that it requires a very specific combination of skill sets, and this has been difficult to find for other individuals. I didn't talk really about the climate security mechanism, but this is the body within the UN that's helping to support this role. So the climate security mechanism is really working to build up tools and knowledge to equip other similar posts. The second challenge relates to stronger support from the UN Security Council and member states. So on one hand, there has been good support from some member states, including, for example, Germany, which has been funding this position. However, because the position has been funded through extra budgetary voluntary funds, this means that it's funded just on a year-to-year basis, and it prevents longer-term strategic planning. And then finally, mandated language on climate emissions remains somewhat weak. So the mandate for UNSOM does provide an entry point to do this work, but stronger mandate language is needed across the board to facilitate additional support and funding for these types of positions. And my final slide, please. So looking ahead, as I mentioned, the UN has already begun to recruit and deploy similar advisors in other missions, including South Sudan, Mali, the regional offices in Central Africa and West Africa and the Sahel, as well as the Office of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. And lessons learned from Somalia have helped to inform the work of these other advisors. And the conflict climate security mechanism is working to build a repository of knowledge for other advisors. There is also some movement towards including the position in the regular budget. I believe it's in South Sudan, in fact, that the position was recently added to the mission's regular budget, although only for a one-year time period, but this is a step in the right direction. And then as my last point, I would say, you know, I think over the past few years, the conversation has really been centering around, you know, does climate matter in peacekeeping operations? We've kind of had to make that case of why climate is connected to the work of peacekeeping operations. I think we've moved past that now, and there's a general recognition that it does matter. But what we need now is really more granular analysis of how climate change and environmental degradation is affecting mission work across different mandated areas. So for example, how does this affect DDR processes, the ability to demobilize armed group members and reintegrate them into society? How might it undermine political processes? How does it affect human rights and gender, as we talked about today? So that's really the next step for researchers, is to get into that granular analysis and then start thinking about how we can better equip missions and peacekeepers to face those risks. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Russo, for a well-presented paper. And we encourage all those who presented today that you need to refine your papers. We have a journal called Amani Journal, which is published by IPSTC. Soon we shall be placing a call for papers, a poster, so we can publish your papers on our journal. They are very good, and I'm really impressed. Thank you so much for the expert view that you've given us from the United Nations on the steps that have been made towards responding to this challenge of climate change. My interest would be on slide number 3, where you talked about the climate language in UN peace operations mandates. I see you've indicated there is UNSOM in Somalia, and you've talked about the office of the DSRSG, or the resident coordinator. Would you be knowing any strides or milestones achieved in Somalia? I've been in Somalia for about 4 years, and I would really be interested to know what this office of the DSRSG, or resident coordinator, is doing towards mitigating climate change in Somalia, because Somalia is faced with a myriad of challenges in terms of, you know, turbulent times in weather conditions, hunger because of droughts, prolonged droughts, heavy rains when they come, floods, as one of our presenters has indicated. So what are the milestones achieved so far in Somalia?
Thank you for that question. Yes. So I can give you a couple of examples of the initiatives that they're working on, though, of course, realizing the gains from climate interventions is often a years-long process. And as they're only about 3 years in, the gains may not be fully felt yet. So for example, they've been working on sustainable flood management. And that was one of the illustrations that I showed in the picture. and what they call hybrid approaches to flood management in the Hirshabelle River catchment area. That has been one initiative. A second one is developing alternative livelihoods, and we heard reference to the charcoal issue. So the mission is working to develop alternative livelihood options to help support the UN Security Council ban on charcoal import and exports. So they're monitoring and working to enforce the charcoal travel ban while also creating alternative options for individuals' livelihoods. They're working especially on Somalia's blue economy. So of course, because Somalia has such a very long coastline, its blue economy in terms of fisheries and tourism could be a major source of revenue for the country. However, due to piracy and other issues of some mismanagement, this has not been fully realized. So they're working with an organization that is called Secure Fisheries. And they're working to try to develop that economy and to manage the blue economy so that it does bring in revenue for the country. So that's maybe just a small handful of some of the initiatives that they're working on. And of course, I should say, you know, UNSOM is a special political mission. And so for anyone who doesn't know, the difference between a special political mission and a peacekeeping operation for the UN is that special political missions are there to coordinate and advise and assist. They don't directly do project implementation. So the main role of the mission is to try to support those actors who are doing project implementation, whether it's the national ministries, civil society organizations, the UN country team, etc. So the mission is trying to just coordinate this work and support it with technical advice, while other actors are actually the ones doing the implementation.
Thank you. Thank you for the response. I now open this to the plenary, and Dr. Weston Shihalo, would you kindly ask your question?
Let me enable his mic and camera.
Okay.
I have enabled it.
Thanks, Chair. I hope I'm audible. Thank you so much.
Yes,
this question I wish to ask during the first session, and it goes to Clifford Collins Omondi Okwani. The little bit I picked from your presentation, you were talking about strategies by external actors. You dwelled on the European Union, you dwelled on the United States. You mentioned how the US has got strategies in Africa, and Ethiopia is hardly mentioned. The focus is on Kenya. The intention is to counter China and stuff like that. And at the tail end, I had you mention something to do with challenges and opportunities for the EU and the US. Well, I find it disturbing. One, because it's a given that Africa's security has for the longest time been in the hands of external actors. And that exacerbates insecurity on the continent. I had little critique from your part as far as that is concerned. And if the same trajectory continues as far as climate change is concerned and peacekeeping in this context, with very little input from Africa and specifically from the global south, I don't think much is going to change, because the conversation as it is now, and that's the critique about climate change conversation, is driven from the global north.